Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you so much for attending this wonderful lecture that I am positive that you're going to thoroughly enjoy it. Um, I truly have the privilege of introducing one of my dearest friend and greatest colleague and one of the most uh, kindest humanitarian individual you can possibly meet in your life, Dr. Jim Barry. So I'm just gonna give you a quick synopsis, even though it is extremely brief. I hope that it captures the magnitude of his accomplishments and his good heart in ways that he's trying to help our communities, our state, and our nation in a pandemic that is going on and rampant in every community practically. So I have the honor to introduce Dr. Jim Barry. He is a professor and chair of the Department of Behavioral Medicine and Psychiatry at the WVU School of Medicine's Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute and the director of Addictions Center for Hope and Healing. He is board certified in both general psychiatry and addiction psychiatry. He received his medical degree from Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine, completing his general psychiatry residency at West Virginia University and an addiction psychiatry fellowship at the University of Hawaii. He and his colleagues at WVU have developed nationally recognized innovative community-based treatment models in response to the addiction crisis in Appalachia. Additionally, they are actively engaged in novel neuromodulation research related to substance use disorders through WVU RNI, including the nation's first trial of deep brain stimulation and low-intensity focused ultrasound for opioid use disorder, which was featured in CBS News 60 Minutes. I hope you all saw that. Dr. Berry has been a dedicated clinician and enthusiastic educator in West Virginia since the early days of the addiction epidemic. He is the proud recipient of the Addiction Policy Forum's Pillars of Excellence Award for addiction treatment, West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources inaugural Medical Provider Award for advancement of quality addiction care, and West Virginia University School of Medicine Distinguished Teachers Award statewide. He serves as a member of the West Virginia Governor's Advisory Council on Substance Use Disorders and the Medical Cannabis Advisory Board. Nationally, he chairs the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology's Addiction Psychiatry Examination Committee and serves on the Addiction Policy Forum's Scientific Advisory Board. Dr. Berry's work and opinions have led to interviews with local, state, and national media sources such as Politico, NPR, Psychology Today, and the Doctor's television show. He and his patients were featured in the PBS Nova documentary a while back. Addiction that exposed the national audience to the science behind addiction and the humanity of those who suffer. So today, Dr. Berry is going to really give an exposure to the way that hopefully will answer some of the questions that you may have. What is addiction and how do people get better? And also intrigue you with some of the ways that they have really uncovered in brain disease model of addiction, as well as the critical importance of psychological, social, and spiritual drivers of health. So without further ado, I really would like to introduce Dr. Jim Barry. Jim?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ali, for such a wonderful, wonderful introduction. And thank you even more for your friendship and your presence in my life, to which I am truly blessed. Folks, what I have titled this talk today as Addiction 101 and 501. And so, knowing that I am speaking to faculty and other teachers, I figured Addiction 101 will give you a sense that I'm going to try to get into some of the basics of what addiction is. And then also at the latter half of my talk, I'm going to get into the 501. So, really, the advanced technology that we are implementing right now in ways to develop new therapeutics for addiction from a neuromodulation standpoint. So that is my plan today. I've included my email there, so if anybody has any questions that I do not address at the end of our talk, then I'm happy to answer those, or if you have any other information to try to point you in the right direction. As Ali mentioned, I'm hoping that we can reserve the end of the time for questions. I told Ali too that I'm willing to stay as long as people have questions, so don't feel like you have to rush through those. I got a number of slides and material that I want to get through, but I definitely want to be able to stay for as long as you would like to answer any questions you have. So, what are we going to do? We're going to talk about the epidemic that we find ourselves in. We're going to then go into the nuts and bolts of what is addiction, and in my opinion, what does it take for people to get better? And then, like I mentioned, we'll in the latter half of the talk discussing the brand new novel neuromodulation research that we're doing here at the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute. So we are in the midst and have been since the mid 2000s in what Case and Deaton have described as the diseases or the deaths of despair. So Case and Deaton are economists who actually won the Nobel Prize for giving voice to and acknowledging that the life expectancy in the United States has been declining year after year. And you would wonder why on earth, in the richest country in the world, with all of the resources that we have, why are people living shorter lives than they used to 100 years ago? And what they determined was actually it was the people in the middle of the age span, so people between the ages of 25 and 55 were the ones that were dying at much larger rates than they had in the past. And there were three primary drivers of these deaths. And one driver was suicide, or has been suicide. Another driver has been overdose deaths. And then the third driver has been liver failure. And of course, the liver failure, the why people are dying from liver failure is all behavioral health related, specifically and primarily addiction related. So it's diseases that are caused from alcohol liver disease, cirrhosis, and then also hepatitis B and C infections. So people who are injecting drugs get hepatitis, and then that can cause significant complications for their liver, and people go into liver failures. So, overdose, liver failure, and suicide, and all three of these are, of course, wrapped up in our concept of despair, and also, sadly, are entirely preventable. And so part of my animus for why I like to give talks to communities such as this one is to help people be educated and recognize that this is a community-based problem, that we all have some responsibility towards our neighbors, and that we do have the ability to make a real difference in changing the course of our neighbors' lives and of our communities with some of this knowledge and things that we can do. So the diseases of despair. Appalachia, sadly, is overrepresented in these diseases of despair. And so here's some data that shows the mortality rate from the diseases of despair. The blue graph, the blue bar is Appalachia, and then the yellow bar is the rest of the United States. And so you can see how much greater we are suffering in Appalachia from overdose, from suicide, and from liver disease. Here you could see the trends from 2003 to 2022 and the rates of overdose deaths. Again, the blue line is Appalachia and the yellow line is the rest of the United States. And you can see how significantly these graphs have increased their trajectory over the last 20 years. I moved here in 2002 to begin my psychiatry residency at WVU, Department of Behavioral Medicine and Psychiatry. And I moved here after I finished medical school at Michigan. One of the reasons I really wanted to come here was that I could learn. I was told, and this department had a really great reputation of giving psychiatry residents excellent training in addiction. And so that was the area that I was interested in, and that's why I ended up moving here from Michigan. And so you could see when I came here in 2002, and you can see 2003 there, that it was just on the cusp of our opioid epidemic. And I had a front row seat over the last 2 decades watching this epidemic unfold. And I've learned a lot from just working with patients and working with my colleagues, and consider a real gift for the knowledge that I've been given, and a real responsibility to try to disseminate that knowledge and to use it to help change the course of this sad state in regards to the diseases of despair. So when you look at West Virginia specifically, we are actually an outlier of the outliers. So Appalachia is an outlier in the United States in all the wrong directions. And unfortunately, West Virginia leads the nation and leads Appalachia in the state. I'm sorry, in Appalachia. So you can see here the deaths of despair when you look at West Virginia is 158 per 100,000, which is just mind-blowing, mind-boggling. We had a record overdose death rate in 2021. You could see that we had a 90.9 per 100,000 deaths in our state in 2021. If you look at this map, I included this map here. If you look at the dark areas, those are the ones that are the most hardest hit. So you could see the average there was 90.9 in the state of West Virginia per 100,000 people. But when you look at the dark areas, that's 150 to 228 per 100,000. And it's those southern coal counties that have been the hardest hit of the hardest hit state, which is West Virginia. And McDowell County has taken the record with a 228 per 100,000 population of overdose deaths. And you can just imagine the devastating effect that has had on these communities throughout West Virginia, but especially in the southern coal counties, and what that means for the workforce, what that means for families, what that means for children who have lost their parents and siblings and extended family. And it just has been a cycle of despair that is incredibly difficult to overcome. Here's some good news. So it's not all bad news. This is the good news, and it should be something we are all very, very proud of. And this demonstrates that actually West Virginia is leading the nation in the reduction of overdose deaths. So for 4 or 5 months in a row, we have demonstrated consistently over a 12-month period of time an actual reduction in the overdose death rate by 41%, which is phenomenal. There has been, fortunately, a reduction in the United States that is 25%, well, actually almost 23%, but we're at 41%. And so we believe that a lot of things that we have been doing in this state, and a lot of the treatment and prevention models that we have been employing have been demonstrating fruit that has been very, very helpful. And so actually I'm going to be presenting this data at a national conference next month. And this is something that we should all be very, very proud of. Sadly, though, again, we're cautiously optimistic. Sadly, even though we've had that decrease of 41%, we still, by far and away, lead the nation to the next highest state. So to take you on a little bit of a history journey from 1999 to 2019, what you see here is it parallels those overdoses graph that I showed before. But what we see here is you can think about the overdose, and what I call it is an addiction epidemic. And the particular substances change and have changed over time, but the primary problem is addiction. And unfortunately, with each year, each series of period of time, we've had more potent killers of people out in our communities in the way of substances. So it all started with pain pills, prescription pain pills. This is your blue graph, prescription pain medicines. And you all, I'm sure, are familiar by now, especially living in West Virginia, of the concerted efforts by the pharmaceutical companies to flood our communities with easy access for pain medications, opioid pain medications, and a campaign to convince doctors that opioids are safe and non-addicting for pain and convince patients and regulators of the same. And so you had a massive increase in the number of prescriptions being written and distributed in states like West Virginia. And that's where it started the whole epidemic. And so you can see this blue line over time, the increase in opioid pain medications being prescribed. Now, at about 2015, because of regulations and better education, both in the medical community and for patients, you see a paralleling, I'm sorry, a leveling off or a plateauing of prescribing of opioids. That would have been a good sign, but unfortunately, what you also see around this time of people getting wise to overprescribing of pain pills back in about 2011, and that plateauing here, is you see the advent of this gray line, which is heroin. And so heroin became readily available in the communities and streets of West Virginia and other parts of the nation, but especially West Virginia, through drug cartels out of Mexico, where very, very cheap and potent heroin was produced, and then very elaborate and sophisticated distribution networks throughout the communities on the sales and distribution illicitly of heroin. And so then you see right here, this gray line of heroin picking up. And so that's when we about 2010 is we started seeing more and more heroin in the patients who are coming into treatment. If that wasn't bad enough, then at about 2015 is we start seeing some people in our treatment programs who were using this new substance on the streets called fentanyl, which is an incredibly potent synthesized opioid, and that's what this orange bar here is. So it's 10 to 100 times more potent than heroin, and you could see the amount of fentanyl that would equal the same amount of heroin. And then there's also more and more analogs that are being synthesized in the lab that are of fentanyl and the like, and something called carfentanil. And you could see just 1 grain of this carfentanil could be equal to this amount of heroin. And this is where we've seen the sharpest increases in the overdose death rates. So the way I describe it to my patients now, back in the mid 2000s, I would tell them now, back in the mid 2000s, if I had patients who would go out and relapse, I would say, hey, I'm really worried about you relapsing. There's dangers associated with it, but I had a good chance of you returning to my treatment program after your relapse. Now I tell them I'm scared to death when you relapse because you are playing Russian roulette out there. Whatever you use this time, it could be your last time because the drug, the potency of the drug has become so much more deadly. The other thing I want to bring your attention to on this particular graph is that stimulants right here, like cocaine and methamphetamine, have been rising significantly over the last several years. So now most of what we see coming into our treatment programs are opioids and methamphetamine. And so methamphetamine has been another scourge in the substances that are being used. So leads us to the discussion now of what is addiction? What are we talking about when we say addiction? So American Society of Addiction Medicine, I think, has a really, really good definition of addiction. And this is the largest medical society that is focused on treating addiction and researching addiction, called the American Society of Addiction Medicine. So addiction is a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. So I'm going to break this down a little bit. When we say treatable, that is one of the things that I want everyone to, whoever I talk to, and whenever I'm giving any sort of education regarding addiction, the first thing I want people to understand is how it is a treatable problem. It is not a hopeless problem, but it is a treatable problem. If it wasn't treatable, then I would definitely not be doing this work. One of the things that struck me and why I wanted to go into addiction work in the first place was, as a medical student, my last rotation was working with an addiction unit. And I got to see people get better there in ways that I hadn't seen in my other medical rotations. And then when I came to see people as an outpatient, treating as an outpatient program, then I got to see them get better in the long term. And what was so rewarding about that was not only did they improve, but this was a disease or disorder that once we were able to help contain it, then not only did this person have a 180-degree improvement in their lives, but then everyone else and part of their own lives improved as well. So they became better parents, they became better employees, they became better students, they became better spouses, and that was very rewarding to me as a treatment provider. It's a chronic disease in the sense that it is not something like pneumonia, where you just go in, like if you got pneumonia so bad, you'd have to go to the hospital and spend a couple of days in the hospital to get fluids and get an antibiotic to kill the bug that's infecting your lung. And the doctor pats you on the head and says, all right, now you're cured. Once you leave the hospital, go live a healthy life. That's not the way it is with addiction. This is a chronic disease or a chronic disorder, much akin then to other chronic disorders like diabetes, like hypertension, like asthma. And I also include this graph here that shows that when you look at the relapse rates for all of these other chronic conditions, they're either relatively similar to the relapse rates in drug addiction, or they're actually worse. And so that's just the nature of chronic illnesses and diseases, is that they have flare-ups, that they can be difficult to treat, but you can't cure them, but you can manage them and contain them and give people a fighting chance to have a rich life. We're going to be talking about the brain circuits in a few slides, but also recognize that genetics has a big part to play in addictions as well. That there are significant genetic loads that are associated with somebody's development or risk of developing an addiction. One of the seminal studies that had been done decades ago was with the Swedish twin studies, where they would follow large groups of twins who were orphans in Sweden. And they found that those twins who were born to biological parents who had alcohol addiction, that if they went to a home where it was essentially a teetotaling home, where they didn't drink alcohol, or they had sort of a respectful relationship, a healthy relationship with alcohol, as opposed to those twins who grew up in an environment or a family where there was a misuse of alcohol, that both twins had an equal chance of developing an alcohol use disorder. And now that's over those decades, with what we've been able to learn from genetics and the research related to genetics, we could see that's pretty clear. Environment is very important in how people grow up, and so are life experiences. And I'm going to talk about now adverse childhood experiences. So if you've not heard about adverse childhood experiences, this is something that is very powerful to recognize, that when kids are exposed to any one of these, what we call adverse childhood experiences, such as physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, not having their physical or emotional needs met, growing up in a home where there is significant mental illness among one or both parents, or you've got one of your parents who's incarcerated, or there's substance use in the home, or your mother is being treated violently, or there's divorce, that each one of these is a significant hit on your well-being into the future with a host of health indicators. And not only that, but when you add them together, then it becomes a dose related experience. So more than one creates more and more problems for you. And so you can see here that three, if you have four or more ACE scores, then for instance, you got 3 times the risk of developing lung disease, or 14 times the risk of having suicide attempts, uh, 11 times the risk of using IV drug use. And so pretty powerful data, pretty significant. And speaks to the importance of, number one, preventing those adverse childhood experiences in West Virginia, screening for kids who have these experiences, and then trying to intervene and mitigate the potential problems that could arise into the future. So we are not brains on legs, right? And so I am going to be discussing a lot of the work that we are doing on the brain and how addiction is a brain disease. But when I do that, I don't want anybody coming away thinking that the brain is the only thing we need to address. So we are human beings, and we are multidimensional, and we have psychosocial, spiritual elements of who we are. And then when I look at treatment program and health, and by the way, the word for a holistic and health is whole, meaning integrated. And what we try to do when we think about treatment is we try to integrate all these pieces. So we think about individual therapy, we think about group therapy, which is very important for addiction. We think about proper diet, possibly medications. There are a number of really good medicines, gold standard medications that are available for addiction that I'll talk about later in the talk, especially for opioid addiction. Exercise, treating our body well and right and getting it into top speed can help with a lot of chronic diseases in our health, and especially addiction. Work is very important, and it gives us a sense of structure, it gives us a sense of community, and it gives us a sense of meaning and purpose. And so really try to get all and ensure that all of my patients have adequate and meaningful work that they are contributing to. And then also faith communities, it's very clear. There's a ton of data, and it's been proven for a long time now, and continues to get more and more data across the globe, that people who are actively involved in faith communities, and that even to the point they have identified that those who are active in a weekly religious observance have better outcomes in a host of health conditions. And I've also seen this at play in our patients who are struggling with addiction. So the biopsychosocial model of health and well-being includes the biology, where a organ or system of organs is impaired for whatever reason. It could be because of genetics, it could be because of trauma of affecting that organ, it could be from a metabolic problem, it could be cancer, whatever it is. An organ is impaired, and you think of diabetes, the organ that's impaired is the pancreas, and the pancreas isn't producing the right kind of chemicals to regulate our blood glucose. And so that's the biology. That's foundation for what a disease is there has to be an organ or system of organs that have become impaired and that are not acting functionally. And then there's psychological domain that affects our health and well-being, especially for chronic disorders. So using diabetes again as an example, is if you are experiencing periods of stress and depression or anxiety, then It is well demonstrated and documented that it causes problems in the what's called the HPA axis in our brain and our thyroid and our adrenal glands, and it creates more stress hormones, and therefore it creates worse outcomes for people with diabetes, and actually can contribute to the development of diabetes. Also, how we think about the disease of diabetes is going to affect the outcomes of diabetes. So if you don't think you have diabetes, then you're not going to take the necessary steps to get help. If you don't think it's very serious, then you're not going to take the necessary steps to get help. If you're totally afraid of diabetes, then that, of course, that can also cause problems if you become paralyzed in trying to seek treatment. Then there's the social domain, and we do not live as creatures unto ourselves in little islands, in little atoms out in the universe, but actually we are united and joined in community. And we grow up with parents and family and the neighbors, and that has a tremendous bearing on whether or not we are moving in directions of health or directions of illness. And so if you grow up in a household where they do not put much of a premium on proper diet and proper exercise, you are more likely to develop diabetes just by who you have grown up with and your peer group, as well as who you're growing up among. And then also spiritual. And I put that as the encapsulation around all of this as something that is more transcendent for who we are as human beings, and the impact of a greater knowledge, a greater recognition that we are more than just our material, but we actually have a transcendent existence that is worth living for, and transcendent values and purpose by which we are aspiring towards, can have a tremendous impact in health. So the biopsychosocial. Now you look at addiction and you can see that there's psychological reasons and social reasons that contribute to people's development of addiction. And the main organ that's affected when it comes to addiction, the main organ that is impaired in addiction is the brain. And so we're going to talk now about the brain. And the way I like to talk about the brain and how to help break it down for you is to think about pathways. Here's a Far Side cartoon. I'm a big fan of Gary Larson's Far Sides. But here you have a dog who has created different pathways where his owner wanted him to cut the grass in a certain way, but he didn't get it right, and so he doesn't get his biscuit. But it makes me think about when you have a dog in a yard, and for instance, the dogs, you see this sometimes, right? You see where a dog in a particular yard has a certain path that he's always or she's always trotting, and it creates a rut, and it creates an indentation in the lawn, and maybe the grass doesn't grow there, and that's kind of a metaphor to thinking about what happens in the brain with these pathways, and maybe how we get stuck in certain ruts as well. Another metaphor that I like and I've been using lately because it makes sense to me is here's a map of North America. And this is the migratory patterns that you see from insects and animals and fish across North America that have been consistent for thousands upon thousands of years. And it's pretty amazing to think about that these creatures have been traveling the same pathway for millennia, and it's deliverance of energy and a flow that is predictable. And once you get in, to this is what's pretty stable. I want to draw your attention to here, the South Platte River, and this is where sandhill cranes travel every year in the spring and in droves. My wife, who's a big nature lover, on her bucket list was to go to the Platte River and watch these cranes migrate and land there at this time. And it's hard to believe, and this is just one, but there were, just to give you an example of the number of animals that you could see up in the sky and landing on the ground in these fields and in the rivers is one day in an 80-mile stretch, they recorded 700,000 of these animals flying together, which is pretty remarkable to see and to hear at the time. So this is a picture that my wife and I took when we woke up early in the morning to go watch the sunrise and watch these birds roost and leave the roost. So you see in the middle of the river there's this black glob, and this river is very, very shallow. And what these birds do is they roost in the middle of this river because it protects them from predators, or they're safer from predators anyway. And then when the sun starts rising, then you see them lifting off and flying away. And to me, just seeing it, number one, it was incredibly beautiful and even incredibly transcendent to have this experience. But it also, the way my brain works anyway, it thinks about, wow, I've got these pathways that are really consistent, and then it's almost like these birds are collecting together as little receptors in the river, and then they're like neurotransmitters being released to go have communication elsewhere. And I thought that was a really, really cool metaphor for how our brains are functioning from a neurobiologic standpoint. The other thing that I think is worth thinking about is that for instance, these elk up in Alaska have traveled the same pathways for so many years and generations. And then you have something like man come along and build new pathways that are disruptive of these pathways. And so our job then, when I think about helping patients develop new pathways in their brain and behavior, is they're being forced in different ways because of the society we live in, and it's created dangers for them. Okay, what we got to do then is figure out how do we bridge their pathways so that they have healthy pathways, or how do we create tunnels under the things that are destructive for them in society or through their experience, things that they've done in the past, so that they can live healthy lives and live a lot longer. Which leads me then to the brain. And so you can see that there are pathways in the brain, and there are circuits. These are circuits that are made of various neurons that have grown and connected together that are very predictable in the human brain over time. And also based on our genetics, they can grow in certain ways that might be different than others. And based on early childhood experience, they can grow in certain ways that are different than others. And based on repeated behaviors, they can grow in certain ways that are different than others. And so what I'm going to do is give you a very, very basic 101, maybe even more basic than 101 neuroanatomy lecture right here on the brain. So if you're going to do this, what I'm going to do this is I'm going to break up the brain into three different parts, three incredibly basic parts: the back part, the middle part, and the front part. And so this back part here is the part of the brain that's responsible for everything that we do that's unconscious yet keeps us alive. So our breathing, our pulse, all of that stuff is happening in this back part of the brain. We don't think about it, it's just doing it. And this is a part of the brain that's very similar to any other animal in the animal kingdom that has stimulus and response. Even worms have something similar to this part of the brain. Now, when you start moving upward in the brain and outward from this core part, then it becomes more sophisticated and more well-defined and separating us as humans from the rest of the animal kingdom. One of the areas that we do share with other animals is this middle part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that is responsible primarily for our emotions, for our memory storage, for our cravings, for our drive. And the one area that's the most important, I'll talk about in a minute, is called the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens right here is the area that releases dopamine. And dopamine is that pleasure chemical. Whenever we're engaged in any activity that feels good, dopamine is released. And when dopamine released is the rest of our brain says, hey, this is really, really good. Let's keep doing it. So whenever we are engaged in anything that feels good, like a great meal, exercise, sex, coming in from out of the fire, getting a nice warm hug from your grandmother, a little bit of dopamine is released. And we're built in such a way that that should be for our good and we should keep doing those activities. However, when you start putting in a substance of addiction, like cocaine, for example, no longer do you get just the little drop of dopamine that feels good. You get a turbo boost, a fire hydrant flourish of dopamine. It feels really, really good. If you start using cocaine frequently, then the brain starts reconnecting these circuits such that you continue to use that substance, that cocaine in this example, to the point that you stop doing things that are actually good for you anymore. And so that's where people have talked about rewiring and hijacking the brain. And what they mean by that is this is the front part of the brain. This is the area of the brain that really sets us apart in the animal kingdom because we have more neurons here per square millimeter compared to any other creature on Earth. And this is the area that helps us think about the future and helps us make decisions, helps us weigh the pros and cons of a certain decision or a certain direction and say, hey, this isn't going to be good for me if I do this now. I need to be able to make good decisions here. That's this part of the brain. We all experience a disconnect between this part of the brain and the middle drive part of the brain. For instance, when we're in the middle of road rage and somebody cuts us off, and we might share some gestures or some expletives, and we're not thinking a lot at this part of the brain, and it's been disconnected because we're angry at the time. Just to give you an example. All right, so a way to describe this of what are two parts of the brain, the two main parts, that middle part and the front part, I think has been really coolly described, eloquently described by a social psychologist by the name of Jonathan Haidt. And I encourage everyone to read anything you can by Jonathan Haidt. He is one of the most observant observers of our society today, especially when we think about adolescence and iPhones and social media and all of this stuff. But he describes the rider and the elephant. And so think about this, is the rider is typically like, let's say 150, 200-pound man, where the elephant could be a couple of tons. And so the elephant is that emotional and passionate part of our brains, and the rider is more of the intellectual, rational part of our brains. If that elephant wants to go somewhere that rider doesn't want to go, who's going to win? And so, as much of what has been done in the past that has been kind of a mistake is policies and targets the rider, where really a lot of treatment and policies should be targeting the elephant. So there's two complementary parts. The rider, which is considered the reflective part, meaning that, again, this is the part of the brain that can reflect upon possibilities, circumstances, situations, and make good decisions, as opposed to the elephant, which is just the reactive part of the brain. All passion, all drive. And so here is the elephant. Okay, these are the circuits. This is the pleasure center, the core of the pleasure center of the brain is the nucleus accumbens. And I use this illustration as a money button for the nucleus accumbens because if anybody wants to sell something in the world, they are going to sell it based on how this is going to affect the nucleus accumbens. So again, right, because anything that gives us pleasure is going to be working through the nucleus accumbens. So whether it's drugs, sex, social media, you name it, fast foods, whatever it is, everything is going to be released through this nucleus accumbens. That's the money button. So that's the one area. And is connected with what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is the rider that should be reining in these impulses. The other area, though, that's important to note is in this pleasure center here is the amygdala. And I put it here as the hot button. The amygdala is the part of the brain that is responsible primarily for our fight and flight response. So whenever we are in situations that are dangerous, the amygdala starts firing and it tells our body, hey, either we need to get the heck out of here and run away, or we need to put up our dukes and fight. And it creates a system of catecholamines that are through our system that gears up our organs for either fighting or flighting. So in addiction, going back to the nucleus accumbens, the brain over time tries to maintain balance in what's called hypostasis. It tries to homeostasis, tries to maintain a balance. And so if through drugs, repeated drugs of addiction are used, what the brain does is says, hey, I need to make less and less receptors for dopamine because I've got too much dopamine floating around and we need to create a balance. And so what you see then through imaging studies that have been performed now for a couple of decades, that it's very clear that for somebody who's been using chronic heroin, compared to those who aren't, if you were to measure their brain activity, you can see that they've got areas of the brain in the nucleus accumbens that do not light up nearly as much as someone who isn't using heroin, which means that they have less dopamine. And guess what's going to happen if you have less dopamine and dopamine receptors is you are going to be not a happy person. You're going to always be in a state of just like a dark cloud hanging over you because normal activity isn't going to give you the kind of pleasure it does if you had all your dopamine receptors. So there's that, but then you got the double whammy of the hot button amygdala, which is that stress response. Some people are born with amygdalas that are hyperactive. And some people, through adverse childhood experiences, develop hyperactive amygdalas. Some people, again, through the constant coming off of drugs, withdrawing, trying to find drugs, getting traumatized, getting drugs, they develop hyperactive amygdalas. And so also you can see in imaging studies where people who are long-term cocaine users or heroin users, they will have images that have the amygdala lit up in much greater degrees than those who have not been using substances. So you have this double whammy. That's called the dark side of addiction, where it's not just that people aren't getting the same kind of pleasure in life anymore, but not only that, but they are frightened and miserable and irritable and traumatized oftentimes, at least within the brain. And that's the kind of state that they're living in. So you can understand why somebody would be seeking these substances to relieve them of this distress, despite the fact of the many consequences that could using that substance may cause for them. Here, as I mentioned before, is the rider. That's the prefrontal cortex is the main area, the name for that area. And that's where our board of directors, if you will, that's our executive committee of our brain that should be making good decisions. And those two should be linked together and engaged. And when they're linked together and engaged, well, that rider and that elephant could go in the best of directions and all should be good. But dear alcohol, we had a deal where you would make me funnier, smarter, and a better dancer. I saw the video. We need to talk. So even those of us who may not have had an addiction in our lives can at least relate to either ourselves, friends, or family members who, when we are have maybe one too many glasses of wine at the wedding, our prefrontal cortex has been disengaged from our what we call our pleasure center or the limbic system. And all of the substances of abuse work in these areas and basically have disengaged. And so we have an elephant that's running amok. And what we need to try to figure out to do is how do we either cage the elephant or tame the elephant by either working on this area, the nucleus accumbens specifically, or strengthening the rider, or both. And that's where we're trying to link it together with all of these treatment domains that I had mentioned earlier. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to increase the rider's strength and the stronger reins, and we're trying to mitigate and tame the elephant and make him less crazy. So in biologic sphere, you've got diet, exercise, sleep, we got medications and neuromodulation are all strategies by which we can try to address this. When you look at treatment possibilities for addiction, especially those addictions that are really likely to kill you, like opioid use disorder or opioid addiction, there's two main goals. One is what's going to keep the person alive, and two is how do we increase the quality of life of that person who we are keeping alive? And I think that all of us, no matter what your politics are, no matter what your philosophies are, we can all agree that these should be the two highest goals of healthcare is what can keep somebody alive and what can increase their quality of life. And therefore, we should look at trying to get access to anything that does that for people with these conditions, these chronic conditions. And when it comes to opioid addiction or opioid use disorder, there's medications that have become the gold standard for treatment of opioid use disorder. And every professional addiction society recommends using these medications. There are three of them that are FDA approved. They're the gold standard. They are demonstrated to keep people alive and increase their functioning. And they're methadone, naltrexone, and buprenorphine. There are a lot of gray areas in medicine, and Patrice Harris, who was the first African American female president of the American Medical Association, is a native West Virginian. She's on the board of WVU, and she said something very eloquently a few years ago when she came to talk about a number of things, including addiction. But she said there are a lot of gray areas in medicine. This is not one of them. It is very established that these are life-saving medicines. The way I describe it for patients and their family members, I kind of describe it as we've got doors in our brains, and that's what I'm using as a metaphor for the receptors in our brain, our opioid receptors. And these doors open whenever we are engaged in anything. I'm sorry, whenever we're using an opioid medicine or an opioid drug, it opens the door. And it opens the door, it lets in the chemicals through that door that make you feel good, take away pain, or possibly get you high. Now, when you are used to using heroin, for instance, and you've created your doors, your brain, such that it's used to having your doors wide open, a certain number of your doors wide open. If they start shutting on their own without your heroin, it's going to put you in withdrawal, because what happens is the door shuts, doesn't let in those chemicals, and that's when you start getting sick and withdrawal. So there's three medicines that work on these doors. One's called methadone, which is what's called a full agonist. And what that means is it opens the door fully. It lets in a lot of those chemicals that make you feel normal, that helps satisfy the cravings that you might have for heroin, and keeps you from getting sick and withdrawal. So on the one end of the spectrum is methadone, which is a full agonist. On the other end of the spectrum is a medicine called naltrexone. Naltrexone is an antagonist or an opioid blocker. What that does, it shuts the door, doesn't let in any of those chemicals. And if you were to use something like heroin, the naltrexone could bind so tightly to that door or that receptor that it would keep the heroin from working. So you have two ends of the spectrum, the full agonist methadone, the antagonist naltrexone. In the middle is the medicine called buprenorphine. The trade name for this one is Suboxone, which most people are familiar with. Buprenorphine is a partial agonist, and unlike methadone, it opens the door, but just opens it part way. And it lets in some of the chemicals to keep people from craving and to keep people from going through withdrawal and getting sick, but doesn't open it to the full extent of methadone. And so we're going to talk about these medicines here a little bit more detail. So methadone started by some very compassionate and very highly intelligent clinician scientists in New York in the late 50s and through the 60s and 70s, Vincent Dole and Marie Neiswander. And they worked in inner city New York, and at the time there was a huge problem with people who were addicted to heroin, and it was causing a lot of personal problems, but also a lot of societal ills. And they hypothesized that if we can give these folks a opioid, then it could maybe satisfy what they described as their heroin hunger. If we can satisfy this heroin hunger in ways that allow them to function, to think clearly, to participate in life, maybe they won't go out and do all of those crazy, stupid, and even illegal things to find heroin. Maybe they can actually start getting their lives back on track. And so they tested a lot of substances, a lot of medicines, I should say, and landed on methadone for a couple of reasons. One is that methadone was the medicine they tried that was least likely to get people high, per the self-report. And it also had the added benefit of having a long half-life, meaning that you can give this medicine once a day and they can come back the next day and still have it be effective. And so they started experimenting with this and found that it was significantly improved the people's lives that they were using this with, and that people started going back to school and going back to work and taking care of their kids and not going to jail and everything else. And so that started methadone as a treatment possibility for people. It is a full agonist. It's highly regulated in the United States. It's not as regulated in other parts of the world, but in the United States, it is very, very regulated. And you have to go to a specially designated what's called opioid treatment program or methadone clinic. And they're regulated both from a federal level, but also each state has their additional possible regulations. In the West Virginia, we have one of the most strictest and draconian systems for methadone programs. And there's actually a moratorium on the number of methadone programs that can be in the state of West Virginia, and it's capped at 9. And if you think about the irony of that, where this is one of the gold standard medicines that in the middle of the state that has the worst opioid overdose death rate, that we have handicapped our population by allowing them to not have access to one of the medicines that has been proven to help keep people alive and increase their functioning. A lot of stigma associated with methadone too. Naltrexone, basically the most common form right now is a once a month injection where all they have to do is go to the doctor's office and get this shot of what's called Vivitrol. The tricky part with naltrexone, the antagonist, the opioid blocker, is you got to be sure this patient is through their withdrawal, and that's not an easy thing to do, and it can take days and maybe even weeks to get somebody through their opioid withdrawal. If you give it to them too early, it'll put them immediately in withdrawal and they will get sick. Which brings us to buprenorphine or Suboxone. It literally took an act of Congress in 2000, the Drug Abuse Treatment Act, for us as physicians to be able to prescribe an opioid in our offices the way that people are prescribed methadone in these methadone clinics. And this was a game changer. Fortunately, it came at a time where, again, we already started seeing a number of deaths due to opioid use disorder. And France had implemented buprenorphine for a good decade, a decade and a half prior to 2000, and saw dramatic results in improving people who had an opioid addiction. And so this is something that we commonly prescribe now in our treatment programs. Buprenorphine is good and unique and safe because unlike a full opioid agonist, you can't keep going up on the dose until you die. Basically, there's a ceiling effect where if you get too high of a dose, it starts acting like the blocker naltrexone and starts putting you in withdrawal. So it's really, really difficult to overdose on buprenorphine. Really, there are no cases of adults overdosing on buprenorphine alone. The cases where we see people have overdosed and died is if there's other drugs in the system, or if you have children and toddlers who get into this, and then that can cause a problem. Basically, Suboxone is, and some of the other trade names are combined with buprenorphine and another opioid blocker, naloxone. You know this is Narcan, or as the overdose rescue medicine. It's combined. So if you take it under the tongue the way you're supposed to, That's supposed to make you feel normal and good, the way you want to feel. If you were to inject it or to snort it, then you're going to get the naloxone, and then you're going to put you in withdrawal, and you're going to be miserable. It is, again, just to reiterate that this is well proven to save lives, these medicines, especially methadone, especially buprenorphine. And you could just see the 3 times reduction in overdose mortality, 2 times reduction in all-cause mortality, 38% reduction in overdoses, 37% reduction in all-cause mortality, 70% overdose reduction at 3 months, 60% at 12 months, 32% acute care utilization reduction at 3 months, 26 months, 26% at 12 months. 3 major studies that look at this very extensively. All right, now we're going to shift to the neuromodulation piece. So now we're going to shift to the Addiction 501, and we're going to talk about some of the work that we are doing here at our Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute that has been groundbreaking work that we're doing. When it comes to addiction, the neuromodulation strategy is we are trying to really address the elephant here in the middle of the brain. And so we are targeting the nucleus accumbens with our neuromodulation. There's 3 basic techniques that we have available to us. That TMS is transmagnetic stimulation, is a modality that is FDA approved for depression when it comes to behavioral health disorders, but it is something that we can try using for TMS, and with addiction, we've researched it. But the main modalities that we have been using is because the TMS only still gets to the outer part of the brain, whereas the deep brain stimulation, the focused ultrasound, are trying to get really specifically targeting the nucleus accumbens in a very precise way. And so that's the work that we're going to talk about right now. Our deep brain stimulation work, you can find this on NBC. If you go onto their website, they did a piece on us if you want to look at this anymore. Also, Harper's did a cover story on us several years ago, a couple of years ago anyway. Could surgery solve the opioid crisis? And so a very provocative question that I want everyone to know is no. The answer is no, that there's no surgery that's going to solve our opioid crisis. But they did a study on the work we're doing with the deep brain stimulation, and a much more appropriate question: can a brain implant treat drug addiction? And the answer is yes. Is that something that we researched? There's been publications. We're the first in North America to publish on this. There's a team in China that's been also studying this, but we're the first ones to do it for opioid use disorder. I'm not going to go into all of the details other than to let you know that we had four patients, 4 of which patients that we had been treated, and they have been unsuccessful in our regular treatment program, and they were at high risk to die. And we're willing to get brain surgery to try to help them. And so here you can see what happens is Dr. Razai, as the neurosurgeon, cuts about a nickel size hole in their head and then sends a wire down into the nucleus accumbens. So this is a procedure that is available in different areas of the targeting different areas of the brain, already FDA approved for things like Parkinson's disease. So the procedure itself is not a new procedure. It's what's new is using this for addiction. And what happens then is you get a wire and it goes to a transducer, and we are able then, the clinician is able to modulate with a computer or an iPad the parameters of the stimulation that's occurring in that particular area. So that's what happens. And what we found was in these 4 patients that we had, the blue line is their baseline cravings, and after the procedure is the gold line. And we saw a significant and dramatic decrease in their cravings for these various substances. And then also we were able to correlate that with imaging studies in the brain. And what this basically is showing you here for these patients is that their frontal part of their brain has become a lot stronger than it was before. This is the patient one. His name is Jared. He's been one of my long-term patients, and he's the one that's been featured on a lot of the media appearances. Who has over 4 years now of abstinence and recovery, and is doing remarkably well. He's working as a peer recovery support specialist. He also has started his own business. It's very successful, and just this year, I think it was this year, had a baby. So it's wonderful. But you could see that he's got much stronger rider than he had in the past, and that's made all the difference for him. Keep in mind, they're still engaged in all of the other psychosocial activities that I had mentioned earlier. So Jared, for instance, still goes to meetings. He still is seeing us for group and individual therapy. He's still on buprenorphine as a medication to help him through this. And it's been very successful. Now, focused ultrasound. So this is a different modality. This is the one that was featured on 60 Minutes. And so you could probably go on their website and learn more about that. So focused ultrasound has been used to send sound waves into particular parts of the tissue. There's something called high intensity focused ultrasound, which is actually using the purpose to send high sound waves to areas in the body to damage the tissue. And so this is a potential treatment option for something like Parkinson's disease. That's not what we're doing in addiction. What we're trying to do in addiction is something called low intensity focused ultrasound. So we do not want to cause tissue damage. What we're trying to do is affect or modulate, in this case, the nucleus accumbens, to try to get it online to behave, if you will, in a way that's more normal. So we're sending a mechanical force through these waves on the nucleus accumbens, and we're modulating the activity of the nucleus accumbens. And the way I like to describe it, it's like the Beach Boys. What we're doing is sending good vibrations to the nucleus accumbens. We're bumping the nucleus accumbens and we're resetting it so it can act more normal. And we can become very precise. And you can see these pathways in these tracks, okay? So here's the nucleus accumbens in yellow, and that's the area that we're really trying to target. And you could see these pathways that go to the frontal part of the brain. So you could see the elephant to the rider right there, and we're trying to modulate those pathways. So we put people, here's the thing that goes over their head, the tool that goes over their head, or the mechanism that goes over their head. And what we're doing, we're trying to target really specifically with an MRI. We're trying to nail that nucleus accumbens, and we use the MRI to track where those tracks are, and then we give them cues. And if we show them pictures of a hammer or something neutral, they're able to rate their cravings as low. If we show them pictures of drugs, then they're going to rate their cravings as high. So we're able to monitor in real time as we're delivering these sound waves to their brain and measuring the response. It's 20 minutes. Believe it or not, it's a 20-minute procedure. We usually take about an hour to put everything together and give repeated procedures, but it's just a 20-minute procedure. Again, we are also always keeping people in all the other psychosocial treatments. So the first two studies that we have engaged in and now have completed and published on are safety and feasibility studies. We have a number of patients that we treated, and basically have published there. Moving quickly through these because I want to get to the results. Oh, so you can see the target is the nucleus accumbens, and look up here. So what we're able to do is get really precise and zero in the bullseye and look at how the tracks have actually formed, and where we're targeting precisely when they're under the machine. So we know that we are actually bumping the nucleus accumbens and not something else. So isn't that pretty amazing that we've got the technology such that you can actually see those tracks fire in real time and target where we want to target. It's pretty incredible. I never thought we would have something like this 10 years ago. So basically what we found was that, do I have that? Oh, well, anyway, what we found was a significant reduction in cravings and a significant reduction in their actual substance use. We also, for depression and anxiety, because we wondered, okay, if we start bumping the nucleus accumbens, is it going to affect their anxiety and depression in ways we don't want to? But actually, what we found was after you get the procedure, for both depression and anxiety, improved for our patients. So we found that it was safe and tolerable. And we also found measurements in the brain, like we did with the deep brain study, that we are favorable, again, strengthening the frontal lobes and having less of an impact that the elephant has been tamed, right? And we can see this, and the rider has strengthened, and we could see this in our imaging studies to correlate with that. So we treated 38 patients so far with severe substance use disorder. These are patients who were really, really sick. They failed 28-day programs and other treatments. They had multiple overdoses, so this was a life-threatening condition. All of our work has been both supported by and is regulated by the FDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, and our own institutional review board. Safe and feasible. It's affected drug cravings and substances is reduced. 90% reduction in all substances following the procedure, 120-minute procedure, and this has been supported by objective measures of the urine toxicology screen. And so we were able to print this or publish this in some major journals. Also, beyond substances, we are also studying this for binge eating. And we're finding the same results that we found for substances and binge eating. So this is the craving for certain fatty foods and other junk food that people would report before the focused ultrasound procedure. They get the procedure, and then this is the cravings that they have up, 90 days out. And by the way, we were measuring the other patients for their drug use in these patients, even up to a year and beyond. And so far, they've been consistently low. Methamphetamine, like I mentioned earlier, is now we're on the cusp of an epidemic for methamphetamine use. And so we started using this for methamphetamine, at least trying it for one patient that we had in a study. And same thing, when we would show them pictures of methamphetamine before they got the procedure, their cravings increased. After the procedure, they decreased and then went all the way down afterward. And so we see this consistently, no cravings for this patient who had severe methamphetamine use disorder the day after all the way up to 90 days. And so we just got this one published earlier this month, or actually it was last month. So in summary, with the work that we've found, a significant decrease in cravings, difficulty connecting the cues that these patients have, which would normally induce cravings. So like I have a patient, a couple of patients who had the procedure, they would still find themselves in situations that were dangerous. So they would go to a party, and there would be people who are using drugs at the party. And what the patients describe is before, all those bells and whistles would go off in my head when I would see those drugs. But now they don't. It feels like, oh, well, it just doesn't matter if they're using it. It doesn't have any effect on me. And they are just absolutely astounded that that is the case. It also reduced anxiety, depression, the lack of pleasure, more involved in the community and social aspects and treatment, able to concentrate more and be satisfied. So this is the team that has made up the work that we're doing with the neuromodulation. And I want to end the formal presentation, and I'll be able to take any questions that you may have. But one of the things that Dr. Carl Jung, who was a preeminent psychiatrist and a disciple of Freud, but then went on his own way and developed his own theories, and was a genius. He said that the one population he was unable to treat was the what they called alcoholics at the time, and that he considered that a hopeless problem that he could not help. Interestingly, is he lived at the same time and got connected with one of the founders, his name's Bill W., of Alcoholics Anonymous, and had a patient or a couple of patients who found themselves making use of AA and saw dramatic results through that. And He then was able to have this dynamite quote once he realized, wow, these people can get better, but it takes something other than what I, Carl Jung, was able to offer them. And this is what I want to leave you with, which I think is such a profound quote, is what truly helps people over time. And the reason why I will talk to any group, including this one, is the protective wall of human community. And to me, that is the most important feature of what helps people stay well, is each other, and finding groups and communities to help strengthen one another and walk alongside people who are suffering to help them get better. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and be available for any questions that you all may have. Can everybody see me now, or do you still see my screen?
Yeah, we can see you, Jim.
We can
All
see
right,
you.
so I am happy to answer any questions. I know that was a ton and I went really fast. I'm amazed I got through all of those slides with 15 minutes to spare. So I'm really proud of myself on that.
No, you should be. Awesome presentation. I mean, really, truly, we are so grateful for having a researcher, clinician like you in our state, in our community that is really fighting this battle very fiercely. So truly, you're doing God's work, undoubtedly. Again, I want to really open this up to the audience. Please feel free to either unmute yourself or put your question in the chat, and I will read those off to Dr. Berry. Donna is asking, Dr. Berry, when treating a patient with opiates for pain, what do doctors monitor to prevent addiction?
Hmm. Well, we are much more cautious about treating people with opioids for pain than we were, 10, 15 years, certainly 20 years ago, right? And so there are now a lot of safeguards in place that make it much more likely that people are going to be much more responsible in prescribing these pain medicines. So basically, um, we try not to prescribe opioids for long-term problems. Okay. And we also try to not prescribe opioids even for short-term problems. We've been able to learn that opioid pain medications can actually increase pain for people, that it basically resets their pain thermostat such that they're more sensitive to pain, and that things like ibuprofen and Tylenol actually can be much more effective for pain when you do double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. It's pretty amazing that those can happen. Yet at the same time, right, we know that sometimes people do need opioids. So there's various testing that you can do from a history standpoint to find out if they're at risk, meaning have they had a personal history of addiction? Or do they have a family history of addiction? So you want to be very, very cautious about prescribing to someone like that. And if you do, have safeguards in place.
Yeah. Jim, do you think the use of um psychedelics like psilocybin, MDMA, I mean, do you feel that they have a place in addiction treatment? Yes.
Potentially, it's kind of interesting that, Back to the Future. So hallucinogens were used therapeutically in experimental sense for alcohol use disorder, and even Bill W., the founder of AA, was treated with with LSD to help with addiction, his alcohol addiction. Um, and so I think that it can potentially, there could be a role for it. And there's been the most studies have been done in alcohol use disorder for psilocybin. Um, the thing I would say is what often happens is the popular media takes something like this and runs with it to the point where then it destroys a lot of the ability to really do really good, clear research, because again, psilocybin and other hallucinogens are used as recreational drugs and substances. And there's a large population percentage of the population that just wants to use it for such, and then will key in on media reports that show some research or some potential therapeutic benefit, and then it ruins it for everybody, because then you start seeing a whole bunch of problems when people start misusing this in ways that go way beyond what the evidence could suggest is real. And so it just opens up a Pandora's box that's difficult to come out of. So I would say that, yeah, I mean, based on what I know with the research when it comes to hallucinogens and psilocybin and the like, that there is some potential, but I don't have a lot of faith in that becoming a regular treatment modality that is highly accessible.
Got it. Dr. Cohen is asking, yeah, I realize your talk did not cover prevention,
Hmm.
but have such programs been implemented in West Virginia and with what results?
Yeah, and I am not the best person to ask about the prevention stuff. And Ali, you could probably get somebody else, in the university who's really more on the prevention side. I'm on the treatment side. I do know that there are a number of school-based interventions that have been employed as far as prevention. There's certainly a greater recognition of the adverse childhood experiences and trying to identify and get kids at risk the help they need early on. And so that's one of the biggest things. The other thing, you think about simple things in prevention, again, like having much tighter regulations regarding prescribing. Those are all opioid prescribing, for instance. Those are all preventative strategies, and that certainly has been effective. Having one of the most effective things is giving physicians actually not only the responsibility, but then we are obligated, if we're going to prescribe a opioid pain medicine, we have to go on to the pharmacy database to see if this patient that is before us has already been prescribed an opioid by another doctor, and when, or other controlled substances that can be harmful for that person in combination with the opioids. So those are other examples that are preventative measures.
Awesome. Tom Lane is asking, I currently visit 4 federal prisons in the area as a volunteer. I visit inmates that don't have visits from the outside. I'm amazed at the amount of drugs within the prison and the methods to obtain these drugs,
Yep.
K2 and etc. Listening to your presentation, see the chain when I see the family members and especially the children. Any comments in terms of programs that are reducing the distribution of drugs in prison systems?
Yeah, so number one, I'm so glad that you're doing that. And it means, I know, just because I've done it before too, it just means so much to these folks who find themselves in prison to have somebody who cares about them and is visiting them. And so my hat goes off to you for doing that. Um, so there are programs in prison. So number one, yes, absolutely. If anybody thinks that drugs are not rampant in prisons, well, then I've got a bridge to sell you somewhere, because it is very, very common and just something that is endemic within prison systems and is well acknowledged. Um, One of the things that has been demonstrated to reduce drug use actually is making medications for opioid use disorder actually available in the prisons. And the state has implemented that in the last several years to make, for instance, buprenorphine available in the prisons, naltrexone available in the prisons, and they have people stabilized on these medicines so that they're not out there trying to find something else. And then when they get discharged from prison, typically that would be a period of time that puts them highest at risk for overdose. The 2 weeks discharge from prison is one of the most vulnerable populations that you can think of, and having people discharged on those medicines significantly increases their likelihood of engaging in treatment and staying alive out of prison.
Yeah. Sandra is asking, do you think there is an alcoholic or addictive personality, or could anyone become addicted to alcohol or other drugs by drinking or using enough for long enough, that threshold differing in individuals, but everyone at potential risk?
Yeah. So I do not think there's a certain personality. Um, However, there are certain personality disorders that do put people higher at risk for developing like alcohol addiction. And so for antisocial personality or borderline personality, it puts people at higher risk for alcohol or other addictions. So there that is the case. But the last part of that question is yes, is anybody can develop an addiction if they use a substance that is addictive long enough and large enough amounts. So some people are born with brains that are already at risk because of the parents and grandparents and great great parents that they had they didn't ask for. So their brains are already at risk for that. To give you an example, so it's about 1 out of 10 people um, will really will be at risk for having more of a genetic load for opioid addiction, for example. And so 9 out of 10 people of us, right? Most of us, if we were to have a prescription pain pill for a broken arm or something. I had some for I broke my arm years back, and and they gave me a couple days worth of hydrocodones. And I remember feeling it that, okay, I feel kind of blah. I can't think very well, and I didn't really like it. So that's going to be the case for about 9 out of 10 people. There's going to be 1 out of 10 people, though, once they have that pain pill, they're going to say, oh my gosh, where have you been all my life? And it's going to remove all of their anxiety. It's going to remove all of their angst and stress and light up that nucleus accumbens to feel just so good. And it's just genetically, they're loaded to experience that substance in ways the rest of us aren't. So there is that. But without a doubt, if you drink, for instance, on a regular basis long enough, you will develop an alcohol use disorder.
Yeah, that's a great point. Jim, there was an article that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine last week that actually showed uh, paternal uh, individuals who have a daughter actually have a shortened lifespan. In other words, if they have, smoking addictions, do we see that in addicted populations to drugs and alcohol that their offsprings may actually also have a risk for altered aging? In other words, accelerated aging.
So I don't know specifically about accelerated aging, okay? So I can't speak to that specifically. However, I do know for a fact that the work that's been done in epigenetics has definitely demonstrated that what people use. So, for instance, whether it's like your example, right? I'll use this example. They've demonstrated this both in rats and in adult human males. So for rats, for instance, that they expose to marijuana or cannabis smoke, and they get these male rats exposed to marijuana. There's actually what's called epigenetic changes that happen in the sperm of those rats that make it more significantly more likely that that particular rat's offspring will develop addiction to a whole bunch of other substances.
Mm.
And you also see that in humans as well. So it's yeah, the field of epigenetics is so mind blowing, and we're just scratching the surface. But it speaks to the reality that the choices we make regarding substances now can have unanticipated consequences for generations to come. We kind of already know that, right? For women who use when they're pregnant, of course, that it's going to affect the developing baby in the womb and all of that stuff. But what we're learning more and more is not only that, but even women using before they get pregnant, and even men using, and how that can have chain reactions for generations.
Yeah, that's a great response. Uh, do the pathophysiologies of addiction are the same in nucleus accumbens? In other words, alcohol addiction, drug addiction, gambling, do they have the same mode of pathophysiology?
Very similar. The physiology is going to be a little different for each substance. There's some commonalities, but I think the best way to think about it is the end stage of that pathway is all going to be the same. It's all going to funnel through the nucleus accumbens and release dopamine. And that dopamine track, those tracks go out into the frontal part of the brain where we are actually recognizing, oh, this feels good. I need to keep doing it. It's going to the middle part of the brain to create memories and file cues to all the behaviors that are associated with that are getting filed in our brains so that it becomes pretty automatic. And, that's why we tell people to avoid people, places, and things when it comes to these substances. But the physiology and the neurotransmitters for each substance may differ in how they're acting.
Awesome. I know we have come to the top of the hours. I really want to be cognizant of your time, Dr. Berry. I cannot tell you how grateful we are for having you today as our guest speaker. Thank you so much for your time. It was extremely informative and educational to the audience. We will be putting the link as well as sending Dr. Berry's presentation to all the attendees. And if you have any question, again, you have at the beginning Dr. Berry's email, or if you forgot about it, definitely will be in his presentation as well. You can always send the email to me. I will definitely address it to him and get the response back to you. Again, Dr. Berry, thank you so much for your time. Really grateful for you to be at the head of the Department of Behavioral Medicine and Psychiatry, and having truly a human uh, giant in our state of West Virginia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ali. I really appreciate the invitation. And thanks to everyone who joined today. It was a pleasure.